Thank you for joining us. The Columbian's Editorial Board is pleased to welcome candidates for State Attorney General. I'm Greg Jane. I'm the editorial page editor at the Columbian, and I'll let the other board members introduce themselves.
I'm Ben Campbell. I'm co-owner and publisher of the Columbian.
Hi, I'm Colleen Keller. I'm the assistant news editor of the Columbian and a member of the editorial board.
And I'm Craig Brown, the editor of the Columbian and Columbian.com.
And thanks again for joining us. Just so you know, we are recording this. We will post it unedited on our website and our YouTube channel. And with that, we will move to the candidates. Please take just 1 to 2 minutes, introduce yourselves, explain why you are running for this position, and then we will move on to specific policy questions. And we'll start with Nick.
Well, good morning, everyone. Thank you for allowing us the opportunity to introduce ourselves and talk about this very important position for the state of Washington. Just briefly about me, I grew up in Washington in Pierce County. Both my parents were military veterans and public servants, and really pushed me throughout my life to be engaged in the public sector. And I think that ultimately I'm here because of their foundation for me. I left Washington to go off to college at Morehouse College in Atlanta, Georgia, on an Army ROTC scholarship, and then to law school at Harvard, and started my legal career as an Army JAG lawyer, serving all over the country, all over the world, and then found my way into doing criminal work, both as a defense lawyer and prosecutor. I then joined the Department of Justice, where I did complex criminal cases for the Western District for about 6 years, and then found my way down to Olympia, working with Governor Inslee as his general counsel during his first term. And for me, that was a real change in perspective, just recognizing that I think most of the things that we all care about are mostly decided at a state and local level and not in Washington, D.C., and found that we had an ability to work to improve people's lives, and worked for the governor, worked really closely with the AG's office and their team, and really was proud of the work that we did there. I came back to Seattle, did private practice for a number of years before I was appointed by President Biden as the U.S. Attorney for Western Washington. I ultimately decided to run for Attorney General because I think the work just really matters. I've dedicated most of my career in the public sector, trying to figure out how we improve people's lives, how we keep people safe, and how we make Washington a better place to live. And that was really compelling for me when I knew there was going to be an opportunity to run in an open seat. I'm excited about the race. We're obviously just a few weeks away now after a very long campaign, but really believe that my background as a lawyer and a leader and my values align with Washington State, and think I'm uniquely qualified to take on this role, and look forward to your questions.
Great, thank you. And Pete?
Yeah, thank you, and thanks for having us this morning. Obviously, Pete Serrano, running for Attorney General, and I moved up here 9 years ago, just shy of 10 years ago, from California, where I'd been practicing energy and environmental law. I came up here to work at the Hanford site, to do everything I could to work with the federal government and the state government to actually work towards remediation. And I think there's been some success at the Hanford site. I know folks think it's a little too delayed, a little too slow, but there are some certainly incremental wins. One of the things that I experienced there was the tension between the federal and the state government. And I will tell you this, I think fundamentally we all have the goal of cleaning up that site, but it's the distinction of how, where, and when to do it. And understanding the differences between the purpose of the DOE cleanup, ecology's interest in the regulatory space of that site, gave me a really keen insight in some of the nuanced issues between the federal and state government, and again, where tensions lie and how we can work to resolve those. Compounding that, I've spent the past 7 years in public service as a city council member, now as the mayor of Pasco. And that's given me a really keen insight on what it means to be the leader of a local jurisdiction. And I was about to say a small local jurisdiction, but Pasco's got 80,000 people. So when I show up to meetings every Monday, knowing that I'm the figurehead of the city, I've got 80,000 people sitting on my shoulders, their livelihoods, their ability to succeed. What Washington is missing absolutely right now is leadership. And I believe that not only my experience in working with both the state and federal government, but also leading a municipal government has uniquely qualified me to bring to the people their voice to the forefront. My experience in environmental and energy law, because this is the next upcoming crisis for our state, will help situate me in a way where I can advise with real measured experience. And then just in closing, I've spent the past 3 years standing for the people of Washington, trying to push the government to be more transparent, to look closer to the Constitution. And as your Attorney General, I'll lead with those two elements as my key, fundamental core values.
Great, thank you. And thanks again, both of you, for joining us. I want to start with part of the Attorney General's role is to defend and support the legislature and the laws that they pass. How vigorously would your office support a law that you personally disagree with? And we'll start with Pete.
Yeah, thanks for the question. There's no question that I obviously disagree with a lot of the laws that have been recently passed, which is why I've been involved in several lawsuits challenging them based on constitutional bases. What I've discussed is what I want to do is ensure that, one, the legislature gets good advice, that it's not just, passing the buck and saying, okay, you're the legislature, you get what you want. I'd like to set, a constitutional group, people that are conservative, people that are liberal, people that are more moderate, and maybe somewhat agnostic, not only politically, but about the Constitution, and have a group of 6 or 7 to really dive into constitutional analysis for the Attorney General's office, that when we get questions from the legislature, we see bills we know we need to opine on, that we actually provide that advice. I think that's not only true for the legislature, but also for the agencies. And I've said this, my job is to advise them, and I will struggle. Admittedly, I have an oath to the Constitution of the United States and the Washington and then Washington laws. And so when the legislature fails to put me in a position where I can support all 3 elements of my oath, at some point, someone's got to make that decision, and it won't be the legislature making that decision for me. But that's why we have to get in front of the advice and give that really solid constitutional-based advice from day one.
Real quick, Pete, give me 1 or 2 examples of laws passed by the legislature that you disagree with or you felt were unconstitutional.
Well, obviously through my work at Silent Majority Foundation, we've had a couple of firearms cases. Those were passed through the legislature. So, the so-called large capacity magazine ban and the assault weapons ban. And I think, the telling point on the large capacity magazine ban is, the Cowlitz County Superior Court issued a 55-page opinion agreeing with the notion that a ban of such items was in fact unconstitutional, but under both the Washington and federal constitutions.
Okay, thanks. Nick, how vigorously would you defend laws you might disagree with?
Well, I'm glad you started with this question because I think it is one area where Pete and I just have really strong disagreements. I believe that it is the obligation of the Attorney General to defend the laws of Washington State, whether those are passed by the legislature or by the people. It is almost part of the job description that you are the legal representative for the state of Washington. So when the legislature decides to pass a bill, first and foremost, it is presumed constitutional. And I do not believe that we should abdicate that responsibility and push it off to somebody else. And Pete is right, at least in part of his answer. I do think we need to work really affirmatively to work with the legislature to make sure they understand the impact of the laws that they are contemplating, to deliberate whether or not there's things that are questionable about those laws so we can shore them up to make sure that they're as defensible as possible. But once those laws are passed, again, either by the people or by the legislature, it is the job of the AG's office to defend those laws. We need to do that. We need to make sure that we can go in court and be that advocate for them. In prior conversations that Pete and I have had with another editorial board and in various forums, he's made very plain that if he personally makes the decision that he disagrees with those laws, that he won't defend them. And he highlighted some of the gun laws in particular. Keep in mind that at least at this point, no law passed by the state of Washington has been found unconstitutional. In fact, they've been pretty consistently upheld. So we need to make sure that we don't let our personal views and opposition to laws that are being contemplated affect our judgment. There are sound legal arguments to make on behalf of the legislature in every case, in every bill that I've seen them pass. And I do not believe that we should pass that buck to the taxpayers to fund outside counsel to defend the legislature or any other law that's passed by the state of Washington.
And want to go back to Pete, because both of you mentioned some gun rights cases. How vigorously would you defend laws that have been passed by the legislature? For Pete.
Sorry, can you repeat that? My audio wasn't great.
Because both of you mentioned gun rights laws. I'm curious, Pete, how vigorously would you defend some of the gun control measures that have been passed by the legislature?
Yeah, I've discussed this, and I'll say one of the things that Nick said was unequivocally untrue. When you look at the Cowlitz County Superior Court's decision on the Gators guns case, that did in fact rule that the large capacity magazine ban was unconstitutional under both the state and federal constitutions. Now it's in appeal, but presently that case has determined that the law is unconstitutional. So I'll point to that, and that's one that I am working on. Yeah, one of the things that I've discussed is being put in this position where they pass laws that we may disagree with. I think it's going to be tough for me to not defend some of these laws when I've not been in an advisory position. I've said that. I think there's a big concern that I can't just jump in and say, hey, my way or the highway. So I do think there's going to be an obligation. That said, I do think there's also the question will be where is the case? Do I have to recuse myself? Is there another way that I remove myself from it?
Okay, thank you. And Nick, any follow-up thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think this is really important because on multiple times in prior interviews, Pete has said that he will come in and one, dismiss those gun cases, and two, explain to any staff that doesn't agree with this decision that they can go find a new job. So he's not only talking about his own position, he's talking about the men and women of the Attorney General's office who are non-political, who are civil servants, and firing them essentially if they don't agree with his position on these gun laws. And again, I do believe it's the fundamental obligation to defend the laws as passed by the state of Washington. That is the job of the Attorney General. That is what the job description includes. And we need to hire and elect an Attorney General who understands that responsibility and takes it seriously. And, there's going to be things that the legislature passes that I personally don't agree with, but I will defend those laws just as vigorously.
And so one final question on this before we move on. And Pete, is that an accurate characterization of how you would respond to those laws? Pete?
Are you asking whether or not Nick's characterization?
Yes. But have you suggested that you would recommend people can find another job if they disagree with you?
It's not about disagreeing with me. What I've said is as we change the agency, as we look at where the things are headed, I want to give people the opportunity to, determine whether or not they want to work with me. And I think the reality is I would likely find myself, some folks will be gone when I get there. Some folks will disagree with the analysis that I bring forward. And, if we don't meet eye to eye, I certainly would be willing to dismiss people. It's not just about my way or the highway, though. I think there's a full-fledged analysis, and we talk about things. We sit down and we ask where things are going. And again, I think there's a certain question as to whether or not, if the alignment is so fractured that we can't meet, then, we're not going to be able to work together.
Okay, thank you. We'll move on now. Craig?
Sure. The incumbent Attorney General boasts about his records at suing the Trump administration. Assuming you are elected and President Trump is elected, would you see the Washington Attorney General's office continuing to vigorously sue the Trump administration? And I'll start with Nick.
Sure. My starting analysis is the same regardless of who's in the White House. I mean, I'm obviously a Democrat. I think a potential Trump administration poses some unique challenges to the country and to state of Washington. But it is not my operating philosophy to litigate just for litigation's sake. If there are challenges that impact Washingtonians or impinge on the rights of Washingtonians, then I will certainly look aggressively to make sure that we use all of the tools of the office to defend our rights and interests here, whether that's through litigation, whether that's through collaboration with other states. And again, I do think a potential Trump administration poses some unique threats that we will likely not see from a Harris administration. But the same analysis is there. If we have Vice President Harris is elected and she's passing laws or taking policy positions that I think impact the lives of Washingtonians, then we should be aggressive. Because I think fundamentally the job of the Attorney General is twofold. One is to defend the state of Washington and all the agencies therein. But two is to defend the people of the state of Washington and be their advocate, whether that's on consumer protection laws, civil rights laws, environmental enforcement, abortion protections, and healthcare. If there are things that are impact Washingtonians, then I will take those seriously and absolutely use the tools that we have available.
Okay, thank you. Pete, how about you?
Yeah, I think regardless of who sits in the White House, my job, as Nick said, is to defend the people of Washington, to protect our rights. And so regardless of whether it's, a Harris administration or Trump administration, if the president or any of the agencies, the executive agencies, starts to infringe or continue on the people's rights, there's no question in my mind it will be my obligation to either work amicably and find a resolution, work, as Nick mentioned, with other states, or, the last stop is to file a lawsuit. So it doesn't matter, whether it's President Trump or President Harris. My job is focused squarely on Washington and whatever it takes to defend our rights.
Okay, fast follow-up. So consumer protection lawsuits have been a hallmark of the current Attorney General's office. Would you see that number increasing, decreasing, or staying about the same, Pete?
I mean, you're asking me to really cast a crystal ball here. I don't know whether it would increase. I think it's really fundamentally going to depend on what happens. My working assumption is we'd probably stay about the same. But I do think there are some issues that really haven't been addressed, cyber crimes and other issues related thereto. So I do think there's that. One thing I'm excited about, and I know this isn't necessarily a Consumer Protection Act, but, organized retail theft is becoming I'm not excited it's become an issue. I'm excited that the legislature has granted some monies for the Attorney General's office to tackle the issue. And I'd like to make sure that group has adequate support and hopefully maybe a little bit more support from what I'm hearing they need. So, whether it's a 1-for-1, it really just depends on what the landscape looks like.
Okay, Nick, would you envision a Attorney General's office with vigorous consumer protection lawsuits?
Yes, absolutely. And I think it's one of the hallmarks of this office, not only for the recent 12 years under AG Ferguson, but even going back, 2 or 3 attorney generals. I think we've seen a real steady position of leadership. I was in law school when then Attorney General Gregoire was bringing in tobacco litigation, or right after that. And, we led the country in a really important consumer protection and healthcare action, along with many other attorney generals. There are some really important work that AG Rob McKenna did as well. And obviously, AG Ferguson and his team have grown that office substantially. And so I think that is the right for Washingtonians to make sure that we're using the Consumer Protection Act vigorously. I do think it's important to think about it both as a litigative tool and a problem-solving tool. It doesn't mean that every Washington company needs to be worried about a lawsuit, but we need to make sure that they're following the laws of the state of Washington in the best interest of Washington consumers. And so sometimes that might mean litigation. Sometimes that might mean just us and our team reaching out to them to say, here, we've been privy to this concern raised by a constituent. Can you please provide more transparency around this issue or this business practice? Is there some reason that they don't understand their obligation? Is there some collaboration that we need to do? But I think that it's a really important tool. And there are some new areas where I'd like to make sure that we're also keeping mind of that tool, particularly around housing. No matter where I go in this state, I hear people raise concerns about housing, and that's big cities and small cities alike. And I want to make sure that we're using the tools available, and including the Consumer Protection Act, to address some of these challenges that we're facing.
Thank you very much.
All right, thank you. Colleen?
Yeah, of course, one of the big concerns, and you both address it in your statements in the voters pamphlet, is drugs in general and fentanyl in particular in this state. Pete, you wrote that you wanted to use the lessons you learned at Hanford in addressing the fentanyl problem. Could you expand on that a little bit, specifically what you were talking about?
Yeah, I think it's the notion of, the whole purpose of that mission is to clean up, right? And understanding who the players are, how things are involved. With the Hanford site, you're working with several governmental entities, as I mentioned. You got local governments, you got state governments, you got the federal government involved. You have stakeholders in various communities. You have tribal nations that are involved. And so, when you look at the way that we had to have a broad paintbrush of where and how we communicated, where we were aggressive, where we maybe didn't deploy the most amount of resources, just given the particular project. I think that's a very keen approach to how the fentanyl crisis is going to have to go. We've got northern borders, southern borders, and then, obviously shared border with Idaho, and then port-borne borders. The fentanyl crisis is coming from everywhere, and it's coming from within. And so I think, again, just the kind of parallel approach of looking at everything, looking at the whole picture, time to really focus on cleaning up the streets.
Okay, Nick, what would be your approach when it comes to fentanyl and drugs in general?
Sure. Well, I think fentanyl is unique, and we need to consider it of the sort of public health and justice crisis that it is. We have been working on this issue now for a number of years, but I don't think we've brought the urgency around this problem that it deserves. And, particularly as it is impacting our young people, for many years, we were one of the top states in the country with youth overdose deaths, largely driven by fentanyl. And we need to bring all aspects of governments to bear to be more aggressive in this space. And you all know that there's not a lot of direct criminal casework done by the Attorney General's office. There is some, but I want to make sure that we're providing resources as needed and as requested by local jurisdictions. We need to partner with the federal government, which is the number one place that works to stop these sorts of cases and drugs from coming into our community. When I was U.S. Attorney, it was by far the highest number of cases that we brought was around fentanyl, drug trafficking, as we worked our way up as high as we could towards those most culpable, meaning the drug traffickers coming up and down I-5. But fentanyl is coming in from all sectors, not only from the border in the south, but from the ports, in the mail, at the airport. Every port of entry has had some dramatic increase in fentanyl trafficking here. But I also think being mindful of the solution to this is both the law enforcement and prosecution piece, but it has to be more holistic. I've been a criminal justice lawyer for most of my career. I've prosecuted dozens of drug trafficking cases myself. I know that even if we bring the full weight of enforcement, we're only tackling a fraction of the problem. And we have to be very mindful about working towards addressing some of the underlying root causes. That means better drug counseling support at the local level. That means making sure that we're doing things that make safety sustainable around housing, around jobs that keep people employed. We're not going to prosecute our way out of this. I think it's a very necessary and important part of the work. And we should hold those who are most culpable accountable for their actions. But we need to make sure that we're using the Attorney General's office to work with the legislature and local stakeholders to address all these root causes and long-term sustainability that we need.
Okay, great, thank you.
Colleen, anything else?
No.
Okay, Ben?
So I'll start with Nick. Nick, in your view, what is the most important responsibility of the Attorney General?
Well, it's interesting. I think one of the biggest surprises for me as a candidate is just how consistent the concerns are no matter where I go in the state. There's always, 3 or 4 things that are brought up top of mind for voters in big jurisdictions and small and Eastern and Western Washington. But usually in the top 2 is around how do we keep people safe? And in my mind, that's a big umbrella. But I think the Attorney General needs to be really focused on how do we make this a safer place to live. We have a uniquely dangerous gun violence problem, both violent crime and suicide deaths. We've talked about some of the fentanyl and drug addiction problems that we have here. We also need to keep people safe in their communities from discrimination and from hate that we're seeing. We've had populations here in most recent years be targeted because of their identity and their perceived identity, all of which makes us less safe. And so I think the top priority for me is just driving that safety narrative. It's a huge agency now with over 800 lawyers, a part of the staff. A big part of the casework is just defending the state of Washington and all the tort defense cases that we do. But everything I think should be geared towards how are we improving people's lives and making this a safer place for people to live.
Thank you. And Pete, in your view, what is the most important responsibility?
Yeah, there's no question that public safety is a top priority. Again, not whether it's for me or the constituents I talk to. And as Nick mentioned, that's across the state. And people are terrified about what's happening in Seattle. Streets are overrun with drugs, which does have a direct impact on the violence. It has a direct impact on small businesses and tourism. Anecdotally, I've heard that some of the large tour ships are telling folks to not get off at when they boarded Seattle. I mean, talk about lost revenue, lost opportunity. I've not had the opportunity to confirm that, but lay to do a particular,
And
as I've spent my time on the West Side, it's pretty crazy. As I've been up in Chinatown, which used to be a total gem, the folks that are up on 12th and Jackson are not only the, kind of drug addict zombie folks, but their behavior is becoming more aggressive. They're trying to break into buildings. There was a gentleman named Henry from Henry's Taiwan Kitchen. His building was actually lit on fire from what he understood to be a group of homeless folks. Whether they were trying to warm it or whether it was intentional, he wasn't very clear. This happened, mind you, 2 days after someone tried to come in after hours in an aggressive manner. So there's no question that public safety needs to be the spotlight. That'll be with working through our legislature. That'll be with working and making sure that the prosecuting attorneys, as well as criminal defense attorneys, are well funded. What we can't have happen, which is happening now, is in speaking with some of our prosecutors, you're hearing about felony property crimes, but because the public safety element, the actual violent act isn't there, they're delaying bringing charges because there's no defense attorney that can be assigned in a timely fashion. We need to fix our criminal justice system, and the leadership needs to come from the AG's office, and that will then trickle down to the public safety element.
Pete, regarding the public safety issues, what role have legislative actions regarding police work and police restrictions, what role has that played in public safety?
Well, I mean, one of the things that the AG's office has done is develop the use of force policy. It's a model policy. And in speaking with police and prosecutors alike, as I read it too, it's a very muddled policy. It's got too many, in my opinion, conditions on it. I think there's an opportunity to really ensure that that's there. Working with police and the legislature to ensure that there's training that can come in the forms of whether it's de-escalation training, as well as working cross-sectionally. We have what's called a hot spotters program in Pasco. That's where you're embedding, and unfortunately, it's only a couple of mental health professionals into the criminal justice system to roll out on call with the local PD. So if somebody maybe is experiencing some sort of, mental episode or emotional episode that results in a violent episode, these individuals are trained in a way that's much more comprehensive than our police officers to respond to such activity. And so I'd want to make sure that we have that opportunity to try to roll out those programs. Again, the opportunity to de-escalate rather than come in and force from day one.
Right, thank you. And Nick, what are your thoughts on that and how the legislature has approached police work?
You know, it's interesting because they've obviously been responding to both challenges here in Washington and challenges at a national level. And, you know, public safety and criminal justice in particular is one of those issues that can grab the public's attention and then wane. And I think my biggest complaint and concern about the legislature over the last handful of years is that they've been reflective in a way that hasn't really led to good policy development. And you know, to me, a prime example is they rolled out both some of the use of force legal challenges and the police pursuit bill. A number of those bills really lacked clarity, and both for law enforcement who are charged with enforcing them and for the community to understand what those expectations were. And after those bills were passed, members of the legislature themselves requested AG opinion letters from the AG to understand some of the legal impact of these bills that they had passed, which means that they were passing them, or at least some of them were passing them without a full understanding of what the law meant. I think that allowed for a lot of finger pointing and hands-off approach. You know, when I became U.S. attorney and was meeting early and consistently with my federal law enforcement partners, I was surprised with how many of them pointed to legislative changes for as a example of why crime has gone up. And I remember very distinctly talking about the police pursuit bill with one of my federal partners and saying, you know, crime has gone up because of this. And I had to explain to them, well, that bill just took effect 30 days ago or 60 days ago. And that's not why crime has gone up. In fact, it's been going up for years. But because of the lack of clarity around the bills and the lack of full engagement with the community, I think it really allowed for some poor policy development. Some of that was driven by the fact that many of those bills were being passed during the height of the COVID era. There wasn't as much direct stakeholder impact and work. But part of that, I think, was that they were just being reactionary rather than really driving down to what makes good policy and what does not. And that's hopefully the experience that I will bring. I mean, I've prosecuted hundreds of cases. I've led multiple grand jury investigations. I've worked with local, state, and tribal law enforcement for much of my career. And I know how hard it is to get this right. And so many of the things that we think are impacting public safety also have nothing to do with police or prosecutors. It is those things that I mentioned earlier. You know, one of the best ways to reduce crime is to invest in early childhood education. It obviously takes a while to have that impact, but there's clear data around that. And so the AG, I think, needs to make sure that we're thinking both about the enforcement and accountability piece and how we can be a value add there, but also all the underlying things that make it lasting.
And speaking of the legislature, attorney generals and Bob Ferguson has certainly done this, but they often see the position as a bully pulpit. What kind of legislation would you advocate for? What would you pursue? How would you work with the legislature to pass what you see needs to be done? And we'll start with Nick.
Yeah, I do think this is a really important aspect of the job, is to use that bully pulpit to advocate for changes in the law where we see a need. This is one of the areas where Pete and I have expressed some pretty different viewpoints. But I think we've got a good legacy of attorney generals here in Washington of using that position where it's appropriate to advocate for law changes. You know, there are some things that I think the legislature and the AG's office have done well in recent years, including around some of the gun safety legislation that has been passed. But as I advocated or indicated earlier, the one area that I'm really focused on, both as a litigator and a policy matter, is housing. And I want to think about how we can work with the legislature to have a better housing policy here in Washington. We have a deficit now. We're going to face a huge deficit in the years to come as Washington continues to grow and people move here from other places. We're expected to add, millions of people in the next 10 or 20 years. And the crisis that we're facing now is going to be exponentially worse. And so we need to make sure that we have more housing built, that it's free from discrimination, that tenants have rights and are able to advocate on their behalf. So that's the one area that's top of mind for me as we look towards potential policy in the next few years.
Now, regarding more housing construction, is that really the role of the attorney general? Shouldn't that be up to the governor and lawmakers?
Well, I don't think it can last or live with one entity or one person, frankly, because I view housing and the crisis that we have now as a really important problem that all facets of government should be working on. And let me highlight a few different areas around housing in particular, both as a policy matter, but as a legal matter. In recent months, even the AG's office has brought cases or investigations around price fixing schemes as we see more consolidation in the housing market and driven by national players. There's more and more evidence at a state and federal level of price fixing happening, which damages consumers who are trying to buy or rent. That's a very important area. I want to make sure that we're using the Civil Rights Division of the AG's office to ensure that housing is free from discrimination so people can rent or buy regardless of who they are. And I think there's a role to play to advocate for tenants and renters who are, often living, month to month on some of these their housing. So I think there's a real important advocacy role. But I do think using the bully pulpit is going to be important to make sure that we're keeping everyone's focused on this issue. And we also should be looking as an AG's office, are there parts in the system as we work on development that are unnecessarily slow, as we make siting decisions on new developments and are there legal impediments to those? And so I do think there's a role for the AG's office to play in supporting all the other players in this work.
Pete, how would you use the bully pulpit? What legislation would you advocate?
Yeah, I appreciate that term advocate because, one of the things I've said all along, I struggled with the notion of sponsoring bills, as we've seen past attorneys general do. What I would want to do is advocate, and to your point, utilize that bully pulpit. Say, hey, look, I want to enforce this. So number one is a modification of the Childhood Endangerment Act. Fentanyl is not listed expressly there. What that does is it allows an individual, and right now crystal meth is on there and a couple of other drugs. So if an individual has crystal meth right now, and unfortunately not fentanyl, and a child consumes it, ingests it, dies or is harmed from it, there's an opportunity to seek higher, more aggressive penalties from the prosecuting attorney up to felony charges. Because fentanyl is not expressly listed in it, my understanding from talking to the prosecuting attorneys is they're not able to raise those to felony level. And so if we just made that tweak of adding fentanyl, I don't know if it's just the word fentanyl or 3 to 5 words to include or something of that nature, but really pushing the legislature on day one. Listen, I'll make sure that the team's got everything we have. I will give you support. You pass this bill and we will make sure that if prosecuting attorneys need additional resources to prosecute these crimes, we'll do what we can to assist there. But we need the legislation, and it's not that you're always going to charge with it, but it's also the threat to charge with it. So, I think it's a great opportunity. So that's number one. There are a couple of other elements in working with the legislature on these public safety issues, again, specifically around human and drug trafficking. That's where I would really want to hammer in, on day one, from the office as bully pulpit.
Great, thank you. Craig, anything else?
No.
Colin?
Yeah, let me ask you about this. We have had a number of candidates for office tell us that they would like to see and they would support a constitutional amendment enshrining abortion rights for the state of Washington. If that were to come before the legislature, as if you were Attorney General, what would your position be on it? And Pete, let's start with you.
Yeah. Look, if the Constitution's amended to protect it, at the end of the day, my job is to uphold the Constitution. So while I may have a different perspective or personal views, if the Constitution's amended, that's the deal. And as I've talked about throughout the race, abortion was modified 50 years ago, decriminalized through the initiative or the referendum power of the people. That's the people's voice speaking. And so when you have these very powerful efforts, again, by the people or modifying the Constitution, which is no easy task, it doesn't matter what my personal perspective is. If the Constitution provides or protects something, it's my job to defend that.
Okay, and Nick, how about you?
Yeah, and I think this is a really important issue, including the conversation about a constitutional amendment, because Washington is highly regarded for the protections that we have in state law around assuring access to abortion as a fundamental healthcare opportunity for anyone who needs it here in Washington. But despite our good stance here, we continue to see this as a pressing need in a few different areas as we see other states around us make abortion illegal or severely limited. We've seen that impacting our healthcare systems here. We've seen people from other states come to Washington state seeking an abortion and having their rights to privacy being impacted by some of their state laws. We've obviously seen the national changes post-Dobbs, and I think it was a really important move for A.G. Ferguson and his team to sue the Biden administration to ensure that mifepristone was available here as an important medication necessary to facilitate some abortions. And so there are going to be continually challenges and impacts here in Washington, despite how vigorously we've been an advocate for abortion rights in Washington. And I will continue that legacy to make sure that we defend abortion access here for anyone who might need it. The next logical step to me is the constitutional amendment to enshrine that more fully in Washington law. I certainly would support that change if there was a push to make that part of Washington law, and if it was impacted or it passed here in Washington, would vigorously defend it.
Okay, thank you.
And anything else? Great, gentlemen, then why don't you just take 1 to 2 minutes, give us your final pitch for why voters should support you, and feel free to mention any notable endorsements you would like to share, and we'll start with Nick.
Sure. Well, let me just thank you again. I do think this is an important part of the process, and I've been real proud thus far to receive the endorsements from the editorial boards from the Seattle Times, the Tri-City Herald, and the Everett newspaper. But this is a really important race, and who the people of Washington elect is going to have a real impact. And I think there are very clear differences between Pete and I on a whole host of things, but I think I'm uniquely qualified. And I think if voters take a full look at my experience as a lawyer, they'll see someone who's been on both sides of the aisle as a criminal lawyer. I've defended people and I've prosecuted hundreds of cases. I've done complex civil litigation in private practice, working with both private sector clients and public governments across Washington state. And I've done some of that really tough law and policy work working for the governor. And so I know what it's like to practice for the AG's office, because I've been doing that work for much of my career. And taking over the job is going to be a huge leadership responsibility, leading an agency with, I think, over 1,800 people now with impact all across Washington. And I think my leadership experience, having been the U.S. attorney, having been the governor's counsel, having been working and leading people since the very start of my career, makes me uniquely qualified for this. And I think voters are seeing that. I'm really proud to be endorsed by not only the statewide labor council, but also the Association for Washington Business. That is something that doesn't happen very often, and I think it's a reflection of my background. I'm really proud to be endorsed by every single tribe that's weighed in on this, who are reflecting my long experience working, with tribal communities. But I'm really excited about this opportunity. I think it's important, and I hope voters will see and support my background and experience. And so thank you again.
Great, thank you. And Pete, give us your final pitch.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I appreciate the time. When I made this decision to run for this office, one of the first calls I got was from the local firefighter union, the 1433, which is Pasco firefighters. They said, "How can we support you?" And what they did was they offered to endorse me and then also contribute. And I was pretty shocked because they don't do that often. But they actually sought me out, and because of my elected experience and leadership on city council and as the mayor of Pasco, where the people have chosen me not once but twice over to represent them on the executive team, those who I serve in my community, including those who are serving the community alongside me, saw the value and the power of my leadership. That's something that's unique to me, having had that elective experience. And so as I look at this opportunity to really bring the people's voice through the Attorney General's office, I know what it's like to respond to that. I know what it's like to carry, like I said, 80,000 people on my shoulders every Monday when I show up to City Council. I'm here for the people, and I'm here to represent them and make sure that the government stays within its bounds when it seeks to regulate and legislate. We need the voice of the people to be heard because it's been getting quite muffled out. In addition to my local firefighters, you know, King County Police Officers Guild, have all supported me.
And Pete, we lost you there. Great. Well, with that, I guess we'll wrap it up. Gentlemen, thanks to both of you for joining us. Best of luck.